you point out, perhaps more controversially, that even on the question of personal freedoms, there are important ways in which China is certainly distinct from the Soviet Union. In fact, I believe in one of your books you cite going to the Soviet Union and the lavatory on the train. You're not allowed to use it because there's no law saying you can use the lavatory on the train. So whatever isn't permitted explicitly is forbidden. And you point out that even though China is not, you don't argue that China is in fact a democracy or that it doesn't have abuses of power or clearly a different system than the United States, but that we don't. But you point out that Chinese tourists travel all around the world in a way that Soviet tourists certainly didn't. So even there, we sort of misunderstand, and by not understanding that, we don't understand why a lot of people in China might actually think that they had good governance.
As I say, in the old Soviet Union, which I visited several times, by the way, not a single ordinary Soviet citizen was allowed to go on tourist holidays overseas, because they were afraid that any Soviet citizen who went out would defect and not return home to the Soviet Union. Now, what's amazing is that in the year 2019, before COVID came along, there were 139 million Chinese people left China freely to go overseas. And if communist China was a gulag that was oppressing its people, the 139 million people in China should never have come back. They should have said, hey, we will enjoy freedom overseas. But guess what? They all came back massively. And yes, now even students graduating from American Ivy League are coming back. Professors teaching in Ivy League universities in America are coming back to China. And it's true that the Chinese political system is certainly not as free as the American political system. But at the same time, the Chinese also believe that in a good society, what the needs of the society are as important as individual liberties. So many Chinese are happy to accept restraints on social behavior because they believe that that's how you create a good society, and that's a different cultural assumption. Whereas in the United States, you believe the most important good is individual freedom, and any kind of social control is bad for the society. Now, but the Chinese are not saying that Americans should become like China. But what Americans and the West has got to understand is that in this new Asian 21st century, when the Asian societies come back, they're not going to become carbon copy replicas of liberal democratic societies. They're going to find their own balance, their own formulas for success. And it's good for the West to understand that in many ways, it may not necessarily be bad for the world if different societies and different civilizations make different choices to create good societies for their own people, which their own people are happy with.
My feeling certainly is that if we in the United States wish to make the case that liberal democracy with a very high value on individual personal liberty is the model for the good society, which I personally think it is. The way we could do that is by proving that it works in our own country, and then other countries might want to adopt it. But we don't, at the moment, do a very good job of making the case that a society with our kind of political system is going to end up terribly functional.
Yeah. And in fact, in my book, Has China Won?, I cite the works of Angus Deaton, who wrote a book called Deaths of Despair. And if you look at the data, this data is extremely sad about how the working classes in the United States are struggling and how their incomes are stagnating, how many of them are losing their medical benefits. And I think it's very important in a good society that you got to take care of people at the bottom 10%. I studied philosophy both in Singapore and in Canada at Dalhousie University. And one philosopher I studied was America's then greatest living philosopher John Rawls. And in his book, A Theory of Justice, he emphasizes that the only way you can justify inequality, greater inequality, if as a result of the greater inequality, the bottom 10% are also better off and not just the top 10%. So that's what's missing in the United States, that the top 10% have seen their share of national income and wealth increase exponentially, but the bottom 10%, 20% have been stagnating. And that's something that can be fixed with good social policies.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier, because you mentioned the need. People might have been a little surprised to hear you talk of the virtues of being cold and calculating. And when you read your books, one of the things that you, one of your prescriptions is to become more Machiavellian. I think this is very interesting because people might be surprised to hear Machiavelli praised, staying on the subject of political philosophy. But one of the interesting things that comes out of your books, your analysis, is that actually, when the United States thinks it's doing cold, there's certainly no lack of callousness or coldness in a lot of American foreign policy or willingness to destroy the lives of others. But there is a certain absence of strategic thinking, and one of the things that you point out is that we mistake what real strategic thinking is. So, for example, you cite Sun Tzu saying, well, if you don't know your enemy as well as yourself, you're going to lose half your battles. And it seems like in the United States, we don't know either our enemy or ourselves. It might be considered non-strategic or sappy or excessively empathetic to try and understand China. But you say, no, understanding China, understanding how Putin thinks, these are not things you do out of an excess of emotion and sympathy. These are things you do because you are a strategic, careful thinker.
Absolutely. And it's a bit sad that the United States, when it launches geopolitical contests against China, decided to do so without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategic plan. And in an early chapter in my book, Has China Won?, I say there are 10 questions that anyone should ask if they're formulating a strategy. And I'm actually trying to help the United States formulate a comprehensive long-term strategy. Because if you don't have a comprehensive long-term strategy and you just carry out emotional actions, you end up hurting yourself. So, for example, the Biden administration thought they could stop the development of semiconductors in China by imposing all kinds of sanctions. And you can see the result. A few years later, China's share of the semiconductor market used to be 10%. Now it's 50%. So all the efforts to stop China didn't work because no one thought strategically. And give you, just to make a very important point of detail, when the United States cut off supplies of advanced semiconductors to China, it was cutting off his nose to spite his face, because by depriving yourself of 30% of your revenue, you lost all your R&D budget. And when you lost all your R&D budget, you lost your capacity to compete. So, you got to think strategically. When you carry on action, is it going to do more damage to my opponent, or is it going to do more damage to me? And I'm actually trying to help the United States work out policies that will be beneficial for the United States.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好。用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。